I want to be sure to make it known that this film is accompanied by an absolutely beautiful book, also titled The Colorado. Murat, would you like to say a few words about this resource?
Yes, sure, of course. One of our collaborators in the project is Krista Sadler. She's a wilderness guide, geologist, a good friend to Bill and I. So she created this book, and it follows chapter by chapter the film itself. So for instance, if you're interested in one of the chapters, let's say the Hoover Dam chapter, you can just directly go to this book, and you will find some more in-depth resources here, a timeline at the end, and further reading, and so on and so forth. So it's designed to, if you are interested in anything about the film, next step is this book. So, and there's going to be a copy in the library as well. So
right. So the Clark School of Environment and Sustainability has a copy. And thanks to your generosity, we now have a copy for our library as well. So I encourage you to check this out. It is, of course, also available for purchase through the website related to this project. Well, Murat, I'm going to start with you.
Okay.
Would you describe the origin of your collaboration with Bill and how you conceived this film in 9 chapters?
Okay. So my film school, my personal film school was making music videos. My background is photography, so I was trained in photography. But after a long time, I abandoned photography, and when I wanted to come back, I found myself in filmmaking. And so part of the way that I learned filmmaking was making music videos. And one of these projects took me to the Salton Sea that you saw covered in 2 different sections of the project. And when I started researching that area, I was absolutely fascinated by the history of the Salton Sea, what had happened early in 20th century and what had happened since. And when I started researching that topic, I very quickly came across Bill's amazing book, Salt Dreams, which covers pretty much the lower Colorado River Basin, but more specifically the Salton Sea as well. And it's a layered approach to the natural world, but also social history, spoke to me directly. So I got in touch with Bill, and at the beginning it was just like, oh, will you just consult this project, and so on. And then we started having a conversation, and the best way to describe our collaboration is just a co-creation, because we collaborated at so many different levels. So it wasn't just him writing the script and me just shooting the film. So I like that, defining it as a co-creation. So that's how that came along.
Thank you very much. Bill, what strikes me is that what you described last night in terms of just rediscovering that the beauty of the world, even in incredibly ravaged landscapes, is inexhaustible. And in this film, we see that very clearly in places like the Salton Sea, in Lake Powell, and most especially in the delta of the river. So I wonder if you could reflect a little bit about how the lessons you derived from your most recent work, The Trail to Conjuroba, how you think about those lessons with respect to the Colorado River Basin.
Well, I think one of the things that made our collaboration work, and Murat directed a collaboration that involved not just me, but how many, 6 composers, 2 musicians, a river guide, Krista Sadler, a Grand Canyon river guide, all these people. And his genius and touch in this was to bring everyone in and find ways so that everyone's contribution was honored. But one of the things that united everyone in the effort I think, was a sense of revelation and awe in all aspects of the river. And that's something where I would say there's a link between what happens in this movie and the sentiments that run through the trail to Kanjiroba. And I think that's something that united Murat and me in our work, was that sort of veneration of the beauty and the awe that it inspired from one end of the river to the other, but especially, oh my goodness, in the Delta, that final segment, those visual images. Every time I see that, I think, can we capture them, just frames and hang them on the wall and have an art exhibit? I mean, some of those images are as fine as any painting I've ever beheld. So.
Thank you. It really is an exquisite sensory experience and tells the story of our watershed in a more effective way, in a more emotional way than I've encountered before. And I'm curious, Murat, are you approaching your new work in the same manner? Maybe you can describe that work a little bit. And are you also bringing music and personal, individual stories to bear in your new work?
So the next project that I have been working on for 4 years already is a similar project on the Amazon River Basin. And the Amazon River Basin, of course, compared to the Colorado River Basin is vast. It's roughly equivalent to the United States minus Alaska, just the river basin. But the film will have a similar approach in the sense that there is going to be this overarching synoptic view focusing on major turning points in history. And some of those, of course, are just like really massive tectonic and traumatic shifts in history, such as the arrival of the Spanish and the Portuguese. And for instance, the boom of the rubber industry. I mean, those are like tremendous moments in history. It will cover those key moments in history, but two indigenous groups are going to be central to that story as well. And one of these groups comes from the Andes. It's a Peruvian, within Peru. They are the Ashaninka. So they represent a geographically very different and also historically a very different part of Amazonia. And then the other group is very far. It's on the Xingu River, much further east, a kind of like a more classically Amazonian indigenous tribe. And there I started working with my collaborators in a small village of 103 people. So there, the story of the Ashaninka in the Andes and the story of the Xingu in that small village are going to be central. And like, unlike the Colorado, they are going to be on the screen with their own words and so on and so forth. So that's going to be the main difference. But the general ethos of music and images telling the story is going to be very much parallel.
Wonderful. I can't wait to see that. Let's open it up to the audience now. So any questions from the room? Any questions from Zoom? Yes.
I was just really curious at the end, the woman that was pointing to the boat, she seemed to carry a lot of significant weight in your story. I'm just curious who she is and what her story is in your film.
Do you mind repeating the question?
Yeah. Oh, so the question is about the Kukapa elder that we saw at the end of the film, that we saw her walking, and then we saw her profile and she was referred to as some of the Kukapa elders. So her name is Dona Inocencia Gonzalez, and she's an elder of the Kukapa tribe in Mexico. As you saw in the caption as well, it translates as people of the river. And they have been deprived of the river ever since, basically, well, as I'm repeating the film, but as the Hoover Dam started filling, it started impacting the delta already. But Glen Canyon Dam was basically a kind of like the last nails on the coffin of the delta. And with the exception of a few years, there was no water in the delta. Now I should open a small parenthesis. Sonoran Institute in Arizona is working with groups in Sonora, Mexico. And they've navigated incredibly complex water rights, basically buying the water rights permanently from some of the Mexican farmers to let that water reach the sea. So symbolically and beyond symbolically, some of the delta is flourishing. These isolated areas within the delta are flourishing. The river is not continuous because some of the land is so thirsty and dry that if they let that water run, it's again not going to reach the sea, the sea, yes. So they route the water and they release it somewhere close to the delta and to the restoration areas. So actually there's a little water. So going back to the question, Innocencia, so I made contacts, I wanted to make contacts with the Kukapa people. And with various contacts, I was guided to Innocencia and her daughter Antonia, and they are essentially like leaders in the community. And they took us to that area where she actually walked. And then there was no audio, but the story of it is that that's an area she used to come as a little girl. Sometimes they would bring their animals and then they would go fishing right there, and it was a wetland and so on and so forth. So that had become a really distant memory to her. So that's the story. And unfortunately, we lost her. She was a really a national treasure, and she was a treasure to the Kukapa people as well. A really beautiful, delicate person.
Murat, you should say a word about the serendipity of that shot, of what happened that day and the camera setting.
Well, yes, I actually planned to shoot that in slow motion because to me, it's like a dance sequence, her walk on the delta. But I actually didn't plan on her starting to tell her story. So I was simultaneously kicking myself, and I couldn't have asked, she was already very elderly and fragile, and couldn't have asked to kind of like, oh, let's have a retake, But I personally was pleased with the result of the slow motion because she is such an elegant person. And it really, at least to me, feels like a dance.
And she just happened to stop and turn at the moment that wrecked boat came into view.
Yes, so that's also unplanned because I was walking back filming her, and then she just started exiting the frame. So I turned towards her, and that actually gave me that frame that you saw with that boat that is so symbolically so laden.
Wonderful. Other questions? Yes.
I was wondering, so there's that one reporter who had footage of, the Glen Canyon before it was dammed. And I noticed there wasn't like any footage of like a pristine Colorado River Delta. Does that exist, or are you able to include that? Or is there...
Oh, good, good question. I looked for like really early footage of the Delta. But so if you look at kind of natural history writing, the most famous writing is by Aldo Leopold from 1921, something like that.
Right around there.
Somewhere in there. So the description of which you heard a paraphrase of this unbelievably rich ecosystem and the waters clashing and sharks swimming up and so on and so forth. Those all come from Aldo Leopold's description at that time. But so I actually wanted footage from that period. I didn't find any, but there probably is some footage like later 30s, 40s before it dried, but I'm not aware of it.
Great. Other questions? Did you have one? Okay, right there.
The other day you said that the film got cut down to a 1 hour version for PBS. What parts of the film got cut?
Oh, yes. So the entire musical section about Salton Sea, that silent film from 1926, which, yeah, I know. And then those commercials, kind of like about Salton Sea, you know, like describing it as this kind of wonder and so on and so forth. All of that went. All of Innocencia's Walk went. That wasn't deemed TV material. And we made, and so you notice that as we get into the chapter, there were just like sometimes just pure visuals. Like for instance, the Imperial Valley, you would see these heavy agricultural equipments and so on and so forth, a way of getting into the story. A lot of those things like, oh, we can cut, you know, 1 minute from here and 40 seconds from here. So there were a lot of cuts, but that's a kind of a short answer to your question.
And if there are any film junkies in the audience, a category in which I include myself, that old film, which seems so stylized and comical to us today, featured Gary Cooper in his very first film role. He's the guy peering through the transit of the telescope. He's not the hero who gets the girl and has the baby. No. But Gary Cooper is there, and that's his first appearance in a Hollywood film.
It's true. And that film is still considered a Western classic. It still gets bundled, and kind of like sometimes you find it in kind of like DVD or Blu-ray bundles of Western classics and so on and so forth. And it was like one of the most expensive parts of the film to license those 3 minutes. Because, you know, it's still in the hands of the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Trust.
I thought it was really important that you included propaganda in the narrative of the Colorado River. Can you expand on that decision a little bit?
Yeah. So I think it's really important for us to look back and see what the mental framework within which the natural world was understood. I mean, Bill said that it sounds so comical, and it does sound incredibly comical. Like I laugh at that silent movie all the time. But I mean, in some of the phrases in it are actually truly meant. Like for instance, the river, enemy of man, finally conquered. So I think it's important for us to remember that in a relatively recent past, this was the acceptable discourse. This was the normal discourse. So I think part of the struggle in the larger context of this conference is to create a tipping point of what normal is. And that is going to be by changing the discourse, creating a new discourse. So I think in that sense, that juxtaposition becomes something to really highlight certain elements, because I think that kind of like conquer, master, engineer, prophet paradigm still is very much a paradigm that's with us. And so how do we create a new discourse that doesn't make that paradigm so normal anymore? So that's there.
Thank you. I mean, speaking of new normals, and this is a question for both of you, we have a question from a Zoom participant that asks if dam removal is feasible and attainable as a solution to our water woes in the Columbia River Basin. What do you think?
Oh, in the Columbia or the Colorado?
Excuse me, Colorado.
You know, the study, the subject has been studied exhaustively. The Glen Canyon, what is it called? The Glen Canyon Initiative has argued for a one reservoir approach to the Colorado, to put all the stored water in Meade and decommission Glen Canyon. And there have been detailed studies of what that would do in terms of the total amount of available water would be. That way you eliminate evaporation from one lake surface, but you increase it in another. The studies are pretty inconclusive. They don't indicate that there's a silver bullet in this. There would be release of much more fresh habitat in the Glen Canyon area, but in terms of solving water problems, probably not. I mean, we're stuck with an over-allocation and a declining supply. The big change in the future as we go down the road is going to be the movement or reallocation from agriculture to urban and industrial uses, which are going to be traumatic economically for so many people who depend on agriculture. And I think what we'll see is that the owners of the water rights, in whatever form they are, will become much richer, and the people who actually work at the ground level in the industry will become much poorer.
We have time for another question. Yes.
The music is amazing. And I guess I'm just wondering, I heard some lyrics about like the story of the farmer. I can't recall his name. But I'm just wondering, like, how was that inspired? Like, were the people making the music, did they just watch your films and then kind of incorporate it, or was it?
Yeah. Do we need to repeat the question? Okay. So the question is basically how the musical collaboration has happened, and right? Is that fair enough? The composers, there are 5, or actually we should say 6 composers. They are a relatively, so they're people, they all know each other more or less. The way it started is that I started collaborating with a friend of mine that I had always wanted to collaborate. That's Paola Prestini. So when I brought that project to her, and I said, well, these are the themes. We had already had the outline of the film, hadn't written fully the script, but we actually had the general chapters. So for instance, she looked at it and she said, she saw the section about Padre Kino. And it turned out that actually that's where she was born and raised. Not only that, her family moved from Italy when she was 1 year old, and where her family moved from is where Padre Kino was born. So there was this unbelievable coincidence. So of course she was going to do that part. Then we really wanted John Luther Adams, who is kind of like a really senior figure in music and music's relationship to the natural world. So like we approached her with kind of explaining the story. And I talked about this at lunch. And that was also very interesting because I had never spoken to him before, and he was living in Alaska. And we had this long conversation, and he basically told me, without asking me what the script is, what he is going to do. And he and he said
made you an offer you couldn't refuse.
Yeah, exactly, yes. So, and then he said that I'm going to write a piece that's going to be about the flooding of Glen Canyon and its eventual resurrection. So that's the middle piece, if you remember. And so I actually honored his storyline by first describing the flooding, and then with the time going back to Glen Canyon. And then the other composers came on board, and some of them were people I had worked with before, but the method or the methodology of working with them was that obviously that I hadn't filmed everything. So, but I had images, I had filmed some things. So I gave each one a document about what each section is about, what its ethos is, what its character generally needs to be. And they worked with that document, and I actually did not interfere. I did not give any further precise directions to them. So they came up with their pieces, and then I edited the film to that music. So in that sense, it's kind of the opposite route of the usual film music, right? Film music is written to the film that's edited, or they usually get much more precise instructions as to what they need to do. So this is, again, maybe my deeper interest in past in music, is that I actually wanted to respond to music as much as they responded to the material.
We're going to conclude with that. Again, thank you so much for the film and for being here to provide context and your experience of making it. Thank you both. Let's give them a hand, please. At this time, I'd like to invite Brianna and Derek to the stage, please. So this is a monumental effort to pull this conference together every year, and it would not have been possible with it if it weren't for these folks. So this is Brianna Gilbreth and Derek Harwell. Let's give them a hand, please. You know, the teamwork that I experienced on this project was just tremendous. So I'm very, very grateful. Thank you. And I'd also like to acknowledge that Western Colorado University and the Clark Family School of Environment and Sustainability, in particular the Master's in Environmental Management program, fund this thing. And they make it free and available to anyone. So let's just thank Western for, again, supporting this event. And finally, thank you for showing up. And I would be lying if I didn't say I had a few nightmares about whether or not we'd be able to pull off a hybrid conference in uncertain times. So it is such a privilege to go through this journey with all of you in the room and all of you online. Thank you, and look forward to good things to come in the years to follow. We'll keep this going. Thank you, everyone.